The final problem. It is with a heavy heart that I take up the pen to write these last words, in which I shall ever record the singular gift by my friend Sherlock Holmes was distinguished. In an incoherent and, as I feel deeply, an entirely inadequate fashion, I have endeavored to give some account of my strange experiences in his company from the chance which first brought us together in the period of a study of Scarlet, up to the time of his interference in the matter of the naval treaty, an interference which had the unquestionable effect of preventing a serious international complication. It was my intention to have stopped there, and to have said nothing of that event which has created a void in my life which the lapse of 2 years has done little to fill. My hand has been forced, however, by the recent letters in which Colonel James Moriarty defends the memory of his brother, and I have no choice but to lay the facts before the public exactly as they had occurred. I alone know the absolute truth of the matter, and I am satisfied that the time has come when no good purpose is to be served by its suppression. As far as I know, there have only been 3 accounts in the public press, that in the Journal of Geneva, on May 6th, 1891, the Reuters dispatch of English papers on May 7th, and recently the recent letters to which I have alluded. Of these, the first and second were extremely condensed, while the last is, as I shall now show, an absolute perversion of the facts. It lies with me to tell for the first time what really took place between Professor Moriarty and Mr. Sherlock Holmes. It may be remembered that after my marriage and my subsequent start in private practice, the very intimate relations which had existed between Holmes and myself became, to some extent, modified. He still came to me from time to time when he desired a companion in his investigations, but these occasions grew more and more seldom, until I find that in the year 1890 there were only 3 cases of which I retain any record. During the winter of that year and the early spring of 1891, I saw in the papers that he had been engaged by the French government upon a matter of supreme importance, and I received 2 notes from Holmes, dated from Narbonne and from Nimes, from which I gathered that his stay in France was likely to be a long one. It was with some surprise, therefore, that I saw him walk into my counselling room upon the evening of April 24th. It struck me that he was looking even paler and thinner than before. "Yes, I have been using myself up rather too freely," he remarked, in answer to my look rather than to my words. "I have been a little pressed of late. Have you any objection to my closing your shutters?" The only light in the room came from a lamp upon the table at which I had been reading. Holmes edged his way around the wall, and flinging the shutters together, he bolted them securely. "Are you afraid of something?" I asked. "Well, I am." "Of what?" "Of air guns." "My dear Holmes, what do you mean?" "I think that you know me well enough, Watson, to understand that I am by no means a nervous man. At the same time, it is stupidity rather than courage to refuse to recognize danger when it is close upon you. Might I trouble you for a match?" He drew in a smoke of the cigarette, as if he was soothing an influence which grated to him. "I must apologize for calling so late," said he, "and I must further beg you to be so unconventional as to allow me to leave your house presently by scrambling over your back garden wall." "But what does it all mean?" I asked. He held out his hand, and I saw in the light of the lamp that 2 of his knuckles were burst and bleeding. "It's not an airy nothing, you see," said he, smiling. "On the contrary, it is solid enough for a man to break his hand over. Is Mrs. Watson in?" "She is away on a visit." "Indeed. You are alone?" "Quite." Then it makes it easier for me to propose to you that you should come away with me for a week to the continent. Where? Oh, anywhere. It's all the same to me. There was something very strange in all this. It was not Holmes's nature to take an aimless holiday, and something about his pale, worn face told me that his nerves were in the highest tension. He saw the question in my eyes, and putting his fingertips together and his elbows upon his knees, he explained the situation. You have probably never heard of Professor Moriarty, he said. Never? Aye. He is a genius and the wonder of the thing, he cried. The man pervades London, and no one has heard of him. That's what puts him on a pinnacle in the records of crime. I tell you, Watson, in all seriousness, that if I could beat that man, if I could freely society of him, I should feel that my own career had reached its summit, and I should be prepared to turn to some more placid line of life. Between ourselves, the recent cases in which I have been assistant in the royal family of Scandinavia, and to the French government, have left me over 40 mysteries, and the rope of all of them. But if we move at all prematurely, you understand, they may slip out of our hands, even at this moment. Now, if I could have done all this without the knowledge of Professor Moriarty, all would have been well. But he was too wily for that. He saw every step which I took to draw my toils around him. Again and again he drove to break away, but I often headed him off. I tell you, my friend, that if his detailed account of his silent contest could be written, it would take the place of the most brilliant bit of thrust and parry work in the history of detection. Never have I risen to such a height, and never have I been so hard pressed by an opponent. He cut deep, and yet I undercut him. This morning the last steps were taken, and 3 days only were wanted to complete the business. I was sitting in my room thinking the matter over when the door opened and Professor Moriarty stood before me. My nerves are fairly proof, Watson, but I must confess to a start when I saw the very man who had been so much in my thoughts standing there on my threshold. His appearance was quite familiar to me. He is extremely tall and thin. His forehead domes out in a white curve, and his two eyes are deeply sunken into his head. He is clean-shaven, pale, and ascetic-looking, retaining something of the professor in his features. His shoulders are rounded from much study, and his face protrudes forward, and is forever slowly oscillating from side to side in a curious, reptilian fashion. He peered at me with great curiosity in his puckered eyes. You have less frontal development than I should have expected, he said at last. It is a dangerous habit to finger loaded firearms in the pocket of one's dressing gown. The fact is, upon his entrance I had instantly recognized the extreme personal danger in which I lay. The only conceivable escape for him lay in silencing my tongue. In an instant I had slipped my revolver from the drawer into my pocket and was covering him through the cloth. At his remark I drew the weapon out and laid it cocked upon the table. He still smiled and blinked, but there was something about his eyes which made me feel very glad that I had done it there. You evidently don't know me, said he. On the contrary, I answered. I think it is very evident that I do. Pray, take a chair. Can you spare 5 minutes if you have anything to say? All that I have to say has already crossed your minds, said he. Then possibly my answer has crossed yours, I replied. You stand fast? Absolutely. He clapped his hands into his pocket, and I raised the pistol from the table, and he merely drew out a memorandum book, in which he had scribbled some dates. You crossed my path on the 4th of January, said he. On the 23rd, you incommoded me. By the middle of February, I was seriously inconvenienced by you. At the end of March 1st, I was absolutely hampered by my plans. And now, at the close of April, I find myself placed in such a position through your continual persecution that I am in positive danger of losing my liberty. The situation is becoming an impossible one now. Have you any suggestion to make? I asked. You must drop it, Mr. Holmes, said he, swaying his face about. You really must, you know. After Monday, said I. Tut, tut, said he. I am quite sure that a man of your intelligence will see that there can be but one outcome to this affair. It is necessary that you should withdraw. You have worked things in such a fashion that we have only one resource left. It has been an intellectual feat to me to see the way in which you have grappled with this affair, and I say unaffectedly that it would be a grief to me to be forced to take any extreme measure. You smile, sir, but I assure you that it would really be. Danger is part of my trade, I remarked. This is not danger, said he. It is inevitable destruction. You stand in the way not merely of an individual, but of a mighty organization. But full extent of which you, with all your cleverness, have been unable to realize. You must stand clear, Mr. Holmes, or be trodden underfoot. I'm afraid, said I, rising, at the pressure of this conversation I am neglecting business of importance which awaits me elsewhere. He rose also, and looked at me in silence, shaking his head sadly. Well, well, he said at last, it seems a pity, but I have done what I could. I know every move of your game. You can do nothing before Monday. It has been a duel between you and me, Mr. Holmes. You hope to place me in the dock. I tell you that I will never stand in the dock. You hope to beat me. I tell you that you will never beat me. If you are clever enough to bring destruction upon me, rest assured that I shall do as much to you. You have paid me several compliments, Mr. Moriarty, said I. Let me pay you one in return. When I said that I was assured of the former eventuality, I would, in the interest of the public, cheerfully accept the later. I can promise you the one, but not the other. He snarled, and so turned his rounded back upon me, and went peering and blinking out of the room. It was a singular interview with Professor Moriarty. I confess that it left an unpleasant effect upon my mind. His soft, precise fashion of speech leaves me conviction of sincerity, which a mere bully could not produce. Of course, you will say, why not take police precautions against him? The reason is that I am well convinced that it is the form of his agents the blow would fall. I have the best of proofs that it would be so. You have already been assaulted? My dear Watson, Professor Moriarty is not a man who lets grass grow under his feet. I went out at midday to transact some business in Oxford Street. As I passed the corner which leads to Betneck Street and to Welbeck Street, crossing a two-horse van furiously driven whizzed around and was on me in a flash. I sprang on the footpath and saved myself by a fraction of a second. The van dashed around the Marylhone Lane and was gone in an instant. I kept to the pavement after that, Watson, but as I walked down Vere Street, a brick came down from a roof of one of the houses and was shattered into fragments at my feet. I called the police and had the place examined. There were slates and bricks piled up on the roof preparatory to some repairs, and they would have believed me, but the wind had toppled over one of these. Of course, I knew better, but I could prove nothing. I took a cab after that and reached my brother's rooms at Pall Mall, where I spent the day. Now I have come round to you, and on my way I was attacked by a rough with a bludgeon. I knocked him down, and the police have him in custody. But I can tell you with the most absolute confidence that no possible connection will ever be traced between the gentleman upon whose front teeth I have barked with my knuckles and the retiring mathematical coach who is, I dare say, working out problems upon the blackboard 10 miles away. You'll not wonder, Watson, that my first act on entering your rooms was to close the shutters, and that I have been compelled to ask your permission to leave the house by some less conspicuous means than the front door. I'd often admired my friend's courage, but never more than now. As he sat quietly checking off a series of incidents which must have combined to make up a day of horror. You will spend the night here, I said. Now, my friend, you might find me a dangerous guest. I have plans laid, and all will be well. Matters have gone so far now that they can move without my help, as far as the arrest goes, though my presence is necessary for conviction. It is obvious, therefore, that I cannot do better than get away for a few days which remain before the police are at liberty to act. It would be a great pleasure to me, therefore, if you would come with me to the continent. Practice is quiet, said I, and I have an accommodating neighbor. I should be glad to come. And to start tomorrow morning? If necessary. Oh, yes, it is most necessary. Then these are your instructions, and I beg, dear Watson, that you will obey them to the letter, for you are now playing a double-handed game with me against the cleverest rogue and the most powerful syndicate of criminals in Europe. Now listen, you will dispatch whatever luggage you intend to take to a trusty messenger unaddressed to Victoria tonight. In the morning you will send for a hansom, desiring your man to take neither the first nor the second which may present itself. Into this hansom you will jump, and you will drive to the Strand end of the lower arcade, handing the address to the cabman upon the slip of paper, with a request that he will not throw it away. Have your four ready, and the instant that your cab stops, dash to the arcade, timing yourself to reach the other side in a 9:15. You will find a small brougham waiting close to the curb, driven by a fellow with a heavy black coat tipped with a collar of red. Into this you will step, and you will reach Victoria in time for the Continental Express. Where shall I meet you? At the station. The second first-class carriage from the front will be reserved for us. The carriage is a rendezvous, then? Yes. It was in vain that I asked Holmes to remain that evening. It was evident to me that he thought he might bring trouble to the roof he was under, and that was the motive which impelled him to go. With a few hundred words as to our plans on the morrow, he rose and came out with me to the garden, clambering over the wall which leads to Mortimer Street, and immediately whistled for a hansom, in which I heard him drive away. In the morning I obeyed Holmes's instructions to the letter. A hansom was procured with the precautions that would prevent it from being one that was readily placed as this, and I drove immediately after breakfast to the lower arcade, which I hurried to the top of speed. A brougham was waiting, with a very massive driver wrapped in a dark cloak, who, the instant that I stepped in, whipped up her horse and rattled off to Victoria Station. On my alighting there, he turned the carriage and dashed away again without so much as a look in my direction. So far all had gone admirably. My luggage was waiting for me, and I had no difficulty in finding the carriage which Holmes had indicated. The less so was that there was the only one on the train that was marked engaged. My only source of anxiety now was the non-appearance of Holmes. The station clock marked only 7 minutes from the time in which we were to start. In vain I searched among the groups of travellers and leave-takers for the lithe figure of my friend. There was no sign of him. I spent a few minutes assisting a venerable Italian priest who was endeavoring to make poorly understand, and in broken English, that his luggage was to be looked through to Paris. Then, having taken another look around, I returned to my carriage, where I found that the porter, in spite of the ticket, had given me my intrepid Italian friend as a travelling companion. It was useless for me to explain to him that his presence was an intrusion, for my Italian was even more limited than his English, so I shrugged my shoulders resignedly and continued to look out for my anxious friend. A chill of fear came over me, as I thought in his absence that might mean that some blow had followed him during the night. Already the doors had been shut, and the whistle was blown. Then, "My dear Watson," said a voice, "you have not even condescended to say good morning." I turned in uncontrollable astonishment, and the aged ecclesiastic had turned his face towards me. For an instant the wrinkles were smoothed away, and the nose drew away from the chin, the lower lip ceased to protrude, and the mouth was to mumble. His dull eyes regained their fire, the drooping figure expanded, and the next the whole frame collapsed again, and Holmes had gone as quickly as he had come. "Good heavens!" I cried. "How you startled me!" "Every precaution was necessary," he whispered. "I have reason to think that they are hot upon our trail. Ah, there's Moriarty himself." The train had already begun to move as Holmes spoke. Glancing back, I saw a tall man pushing his way furiously through the crowd and waving his hand as if he desired to have the train stopped. It was too late, however, for we were rapidly gathering momentum, and an instant later had shot from the station. "With all our precautions, you see that we have cut it rather fine," said Holmes, laughing. He rose, and throwing off the black cassock and hat which he had formed as disguise, he packed them away in a handbag. "Have you seen the morning paper, Watson?" "No." "You haven't been about Baker Street, then?" "Baker Street?" "They set fire to our rooms last night, and great harm was done." "Good heaven, Holmes, this is intolerable!" "They must have lost track completely after the bludgeon man was arrested. Otherwise I could not have imagined that I would return to our home. They have evidently taken the precaution of watching you, however, and that was what brought Moriarty to Victoria. You could not have made any slip on coming." "I did exactly as you advised." "Did you find your brougham?" "Yes, it was waiting." "Did you recognize your coachman?" "No." "It was my brother Mycroft. It was an advantage to get about in the case without taking a mercenary into our confidence. But we must plan what we are to do about Moriarty now. As this is an express, and as the boat runs in connection with it, I should think we have shaken him off very effectively." "My dear Watson, you evidently did not realize my meaning when I said that this man may be taken as being quite on the same intellectual plane as myself. You do not imagine that if I were the pursuer I should allow myself to be baffled by so slight an obstacle. Why, then, should you think so meanly of him?" "What will we do?" "What I should do."
"What would you do, then?"
"Engage a special."
"But it must be late."
"By no means. This train stops at Canterbury, and there is always at least a quarter of an hour's delay at the boat. He will catch us there."
"One would think that we were criminals. Let us have him arrested on his arrival."
"It would be to ruin the work of 3 months. We should get the big fish, but a smaller would dart right out and left out of the nets. On Monday we should have them all. No, an arrest inadmissible."
"What then?"
"We shall get out to Canterbury."
"And then?"
"Well, then we must make a cross-country journey to New Haven, and so over to the Dieppe. Moriarty will again do what I should do. He will get on to Paris, mark down our luggage, and wait for 2 days at the depot. In the meantime, we shall treat ourselves to a couple of carpet-bags, encourage the manufacturers of the countries through which we travel, and make our way over to leisure to Switzerland via Luxembourg and Baus."
At Canterbury, therefore, we alighted, only to find that we should have waited an hour before we could get the train to New Haven. I was still looking rather ruefully at the rapidly appearing luggage van which contained my wardrobe, when Holmes pulled my sleeve and pointed up the line.
"Already, you see," said he.
Far away from among the Kish woods there rose a thin spray of smoke. A minute later a carriage and engine could be seen flying along the open curve which leads to the station. We had hardly time to take our place behind a pile of luggage when it passed, with a rattle and a roar, beating a blast of hot air into our faces.
"There he goes," said
Holmes, as we were watching the carriage swing and rock over the points.
"There are limits, you see, to our friend's intelligence. It would have been a coup de maître had he deduced that I would deduce and acted accordingly."
And what would have to be done if he had overtaken us?
There cannot be the least doubt that he would have had a murderous attack on me. It is, however, a game at which two may play. The question now is whether we should take the premature lunch here, or run our chance of starving before we reach the buffet in New Haven.
We made our way into Brussels that night and spent 2 days there, moving on the third day as far as Strasbourg. On the Monday morning, Holmes had telegraphed to the London police, and in the evening we found the reply waiting for us at our hotel. Holmes tore it open, and then with a bitter curse hurled it into the grate.
I might have known it, he groaned. He has escaped.
Moriarty?
They have secured the whole gang with the exception of him. He has given them the slip, of course. When I left the country there was no one to cope with him. But I did think that I had put the game into their hands. I think that you had better return to England, Watson.
Why?
Because you will find me a dangerous companion now. This man's occupation is gone. He is lost if he returns to London. If I read his character right, he will devote his whole energies into revenging himself upon me. He said as much in our short interview, and I fancy he meant it. I should certainly recommend you to return to your practice.
It was hardly an appeal to be successful with one who was an old campaigner as well as an old friend. We sat in the Strasbourg Salle à Manger, arguing the question for half an hour. But the same night we had resumed our journey, and were well on our way to Geneva. For a charming week we wandered up the valley of the Rhone, and then, branching off at Luc, we made our way over to the Gemini Pass, still deep in snow, and so by way of Interlaken to Meiringen. It was a lovely trip for the dainty green of spring below, the virgin white of the winter above. But it was clear to me that never for one instant did Holmes forget the shadow which lay across him. In the homely Alpine villages or in the lonely mountain passes, I could still tell by his quick glancing eyes and his sharp scrutiny of every face that pressed us, that he was still convinced that where we could not walk ourselves out of danger which dodging our footsteps. Once I remember, as we passed over the Gemmi and walked among the border of the melancholy Dabanus, a large rock which had been dislodged from the ridge upon our right clattered down and roared into the lake behind us. In an instant Holmes had raced up to the ridge, and, standing upon a lofty pinnacle, craned his neck in every direction. It was in vain that our guide assured him that the fall of stones was a common chance in the springtime in that spot. But said nothing. He just smiled at me with an air of a man who sees the fulfillment of which that he expected. And yet, for all his watchfulness, he was never depressed. On the contrary, I can never recollect seeing him in such exuberant spirits. Again and again he recurred to the fact that if he could be assured that society was free to Professor Moriarty, he would cheerfully bring his own career to a conclusion.
I think that I may go so far as to say, Watson, that I have not lived wholly in vain, he remarked. If my record were closed tonight, I could still survey it with economy. The air of London is a sweeter for my presence. In over 1,000 cases I am not aware that I have ever used my powers upon the wrong side. Of late, I have been tempted to look into the problems furnished by nature rather than those more superficial ones but from which our artificial state of society is responsible. Your memoirs will draw to an end, Watson, upon the day that I crown my career with the capture or extinction of the most dangerous and capable criminal in Europe.
I shall be brief and yet exact, in which little remains for me to tell. It is not a subject on which I should willingly dwell, and yet I am conscious that my duty devolves upon me to omit no detail. It was on the 3rd of May that we reached the little village of Meiringen, where we put up at the Oslanker Hof, and then kept as Peter Stellen the elder. Our landlord was an intelligent man and spoke excellent English, having served for 3 years as a waiter in the Grosvenor Hotel in London. At his advice, on the afternoon of the 4th we set off together, with the intention of crossing the hills and spending the night in the hamlet of Rosenlau. We had strict injunctions, however, on no account to pass the falls of Reichenbach, which are about halfway up the hills, without making a small detour to see them. It is indeed a fearful place. The torrent, swollen by the melting snow, plunges into a tremendous abyss, from the spray of which rolls up like smoke from a burning house. The shaft into which the river hurls itself is an immense chasm, lined by glistening coal-black rock, and narrowing into a creaming, boiling pit of incalculable death, which brims over and shoots the steam onward over its jagged lip. The long sweep of green water roaring down forever, and the thick, flickering curtains of spray hissing forever upward, turn a man giddy with their constant whirl and clamor. We stood near the edge, peering down at the gleam of the breaking water far below us against the black rocks, and listening to the half-human shout which came booing with the spray about the abyss. The path was cut halfway round, and followed to afford a complete view, but it ends abruptly, and the traveler has returned as he came. We had turned to do so when we saw a Swiss lad coming along with a letter in his hand. It bore the mark of the hotel which we had just left, and was addressed to me by the landlord. It appeared that within a very few minutes of our leaving, an English lady had arrived, who was in the last stage of consumption. She had wintered in Davos Platz, and was journeying now to join her friends in Lucerne, when a sudden hemorrhage had overtaken her. It was thought that she could hardly live a few hours, but it would be a great consultation to her to see an English doctor, and if I would only return, etc., etc. The good Styler assured me that a postscript that he would himself look upon my compliance as a great favour, since the lady absolutely refused to see a Swiss physician, and he could not but feel that he was incurring a great responsibility. The appeal was one which could not be ignored. It was impossible to refuse the request of a fellow countrywoman dying in a strange land. Yet I had my scruples about leaving Holmes. It was finally agreed, however, that he should retain the young Swiss messenger with him as a guide and companion while I returned to Merlingen. My friend would stay a little time at the fall, he said, and would then walk slowly over the hill to Roslau, where I was to rejoin him in the evening. As I returned away, I saw Holmes, and his back stood against the rock with his arms folded, gazing down at the rush of the waters. It was the last that I had ever destined to see him in this world. When I was near the bottom of the descent, I looked back. It was impossible from that position to see the fall, but I could see the curving path which winds over the shoulder of the hills leading to it. Along this a man was, I remember, walking very rapidly. I could see his black figure clearly outlined against the green behind him. I noted him and the energy in which he walked, but he passed from my mind again as I hurried upon my errand. It may have been a little over an hour before I reached Meringen. Lord Styler was standing in the porch of his hotel. "Well," said I, as I came hurrying up, "I trust that she is not worse?" A look of surprise passed over his face, and at first the quiver of his eyebrows my heart turned to lead in my breast. "You did not write this," I said, pulling the letter from my pocket. "There is no sick Englishwoman in the hotel." "Certainly not," he cried, "but it has a hotel mark upon it. Ha! It must have been written by that tall Englishman who came in and out after you had gone." He said, but I waited for none of the landlord's explanation. In a tingle of fear, I was already running down the village street and masking for the path in which I had safely descended. It had taken me an hour to come down. For all my efforts, 2 more had passed before I found myself at the fall of Reichenbach once more. There was Holmes's Alpine stock still leaning against the rock by which I had left him. But there was no sign of him, and it was in vain that I shouted. My only answer was my own voice reverberating in the rolling echo of the cliffs around me. It was the sight of the Alpine stock which turned me cold and sick. He had not gone to Rosenau, then. He had remained on that 3-foot path, with sheer wall on one side and sheer drop on the other, until his enemy had overtaken him. The young Swiss lad was gone too. He had probably been in the pay of Moriarty and had left the two men together. And then what had happened? Who was to tell what had happened? I stood for a minute or two to collect myself, for I was dazed with the horror of the thing. Then I began to think of Holmes's own methods and tried to practice them regarding this tragedy. It was, alas, only too easy to do. During our conversation, he had not gone to the end of the path, and the alpenstock marked the place where we had stood. The brackish soil was kept forever soft by the incessant drift of spray, and a bird would leave its tread upon it. 2 lines of footmarks were clearly marked along the farther end of the path, both leading away from me. There were none returning. A few yards from the end of the soil was all ploughed up into a patch of mud, and the brambles and ferns which fringed from the chasm were torn and bedraggled. I lay upon my face and peered over the spray spouting up around me. It had darkened since I left, and now I could only see here and there the glistening of moisture upon the black walls, and far away down in the end of the shaft of the gleaming broken water. I shouted, but only had the same half-human cry from the fall was borne back in my ears. But it was destined that I should, after all, have the last word of greeting from my friend and comrade. I have said that his alpenstock had been left in the path, leaning against the rock which jutted onto the path. From the top of this boulder, the gleam of something bright caught my eyes, and raising my hand, I found that it came from a silver cigarette case which he used to carry. As I took it up, a small square of paper upon it lay fluted round on the ground. Unfolding it, I found that it consisted of 3 pages torn from his notebook and addressed to me. It was characteristic of the man that the direction was precise, and the writing was firm and clear, as though it had been written in his study.
My dear Watson, it said, I write these few lines through the courtesy of Mr. Moriarty, who awaits my conveyance to the final discussion of those questions which lie between us. He has been giving me a sketch of the methods by which he avoided the English police, and kept himself informed of my movements. They certainly confirm the very high opinion which I had formed of his abilities. I am pleased to think that I shall be able to free society from further effects of his presence, though I fear that it is at the cost of which will pain my friends, especially, my dear Watson, to you. I have already explained to you, however, that my career had in any case reached its crisis, and that no possible conclusion to it could be more congenial to me than this. Indeed, if I may make a full confession to you, I was quite convinced that the letter from Mergen was a hoax, and I allowed you to part on that errand under the persuasion that some development of this sort should follow. Tell Inspector Patterson that the papers which he needs to convict the gang are in the Pigeonhole M, done up in blue envelope and inscribed Moriarty. I made every deposition of my property before leaving England, and handed it to my brother Mycroft. Pray give my greetings to Mrs. Watson, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, yours sincerely, Sherlock Holmes.
A few words will suffice to tell that little remains. An examination by experts leaves little doubt the personal contest between the 2 men ended, as it could hardly fail to end in such a situation. At their reeling over, locking in each other's arms, any attempt at recovering the bodies was absolutely hopeless, and there, deep down in the dreadful cauldron of swirling water and seething foam, will lie for all time the most dangerous criminal and the foremost champion of the law of their generation. The Swiss youth was never found again, and there can be no doubt that he was one of the numerous agents whom Moriarty kept in his employ. As for the gang, it will be within the memory of the public how completely the evidence which Holmes had accumulated exposed their organization, and how heavily the hand of the dead man weighed upon them. Of their terrible chief, few details come out during the proceedings, and if I have now compelled to make clear statement of his career, it is due to those injunctions champions who have endeavored to clear his memory by attacks upon him, whom I shall ever regard as the best and the wisest man whom I have ever known.